I'm hot, boy. Just the weather. It's good to see each other this morning and appreciate you being with us. I was thinking a moment ago that while getting these glasses out, the only time I really need them is when I want to see something. And I've forgotten where I was the other day, and somebody asked me, said, "You wear hearing aids?" And I said, "Only when I want to hear." And I said, "You'll take them out when I get home." But anyway, I do appreciate you being here this morning as we are bringing our classes to a close. And as you know, this entire quarter we've been dealing with the book of Hebrews. We had decided not to try to go verse by verse through Hebrews because depending on how deep you want to dig as to how long your class will be. It could be as much as 2 or 3 years going through Hebrews if you went through it verse by verse, tied it into Leviticus and even Exodus. And so what I thought I would do is to take the main topics through the book of Hebrews and then cover Hebrews from that perspective. And that way, we'd be able to go over the book of Hebrews and probably get a panoramic view of it and have a good idea of what's in the book of Hebrews without going so much verse by verse. So far, we have looked at the introduction to Hebrews, and then we looked at the description of Christ in verses 1 to 3 that's set forth in the book of Hebrews, those three verses. We then began to deal with the superiority of Christ in the book of Hebrews, that he is superior to the angels. That's the first 2 chapters. He is superior to Moses. That's the 3rd chapter. He has a superior rest. That's the 4th chapter. And then you have he's superior to Moses and superior rest in chapter 4, superior priesthood, latter part of 5 through about 9. And then we are going today to look at a superior covenant. And then if the Lord's will, in our last class, we will look at superior in the things that are better, shows the superiority of Christ. And when you think about the superiority of Christ, the main objective of the entire book of Hebrews is to keep people faithful to Christ. Well, when you stop and think about it, we may not have to worry as far as members of the church about being subject to the law because we know that it has been rendered inoperative, obsolete, no longer a binding law. But the world has more of a pull on us than does the law. And so the very same reasons that he gives to promote faithfulness to Christ, to those who were struggling with the law, is the very same arguments that could be made to keep us faithful even when the world pulls at us. And so that's something I wanted us to keep in mind. And so the word covenant, when you think about that word, That word covenant occurs 13 times in the book of Hebrews. The word testament occurs 7 times. And so either the covenant or testament, as they're used, and they're used interchangeably, is used about 20 times in the book of Hebrews. The word covenant simply denotes a disposition or a contract, a covenant, a testament. When you look up the word testament, you will find that the word testament means exactly the same thing. The same word is used in regard to whether it's translated testament or whether it's translated covenant. It indicates a contract between two people. And basically what that means is that God has drawn up a contract, the New Testament. And within that contract, he said that if you will do these things, I will provide these blessings. And when you become a Christian, you have signed an agreement to that contract. And so when a person becomes unfaithful to Christ, he has broken the contract. Now, God will never break the contract. If it's ever broken, we'll be the ones to break it. Now, when I talk about breaking the contract, I don't mean that you have to break a half a dozen or 20 or 30 different agreements. All you have to break is one and persistently persist in that or remain in that. And so when he says, he that commits a violation is guilty of all. And so it doesn't take you breaking them all to break the contract. And that's why it is so significant. When you talk about church attendance, you talk about study, you talk about love, you talk about whatever you want to talk about. When a person is unfaithful in that area, he has broken the contract. And so the Lord wants us to be faithful to the word we give him because he's going to be faithful to the word he gives us. Now, when you think about the word covenant and testament, then you can see that they are equivalent ideas. It's sealed with the blood of Christ. In fact, Matthew 26:28, this is my blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many for the remission of sin. And so whenever you talk about this contract that we enter into, it's got the stamp of blood Christ on it. And that's a very serious thing whenever you think about from that standpoint. So I wanted us to consider some things regarding that covenant that I believe are very, very important, and to point out that the covenant that we have today is far superior to the Adamic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, or the Mosaic covenant. It is superior in every way to any covenant that you can conceive of. But here's being contrasted to the Mosaic covenant. Now, the first place I'd like for you to look is Hebrews 7, verse 22, because in Hebrews 7, verse 22, he makes this statement that Jesus is the surety of a better covenant. And let me look and see if that's the right one. Surety of a better covenant. Now, the word surety is an interesting word because that word means he is a pledge. In fact, when you look at the word surety, it indicates a bondman. And if you look, for example, if you go back, and I have it in your notes here, Genesis 43, 8 and 9, the sons of Jacob have gone into Egypt. Joseph's been sold. He's in Egypt. He's now over all of Egypt next to Pharaoh. There's a famine that's hit the land. Now, this was predicted in a dream. It was given to Pharaoh, and Joseph interpreted that dream. There was going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Well, the famine is hit. Things are hard. Jacob is desperate in regard to his family, so he sends his sons to Egypt. When they go to Egypt, they do not recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes them. And so Joseph asked them about their father. He asked them about if there was any more children. They said, yes, there was. And he mentioned Benjamin. Well, Joseph puts a lot of pressure on them. He says, you can take this food. I'm going to give it to you, but when you go back, you bring Benjamin with you. And he held one of them hostage until they brought Benjamin back. Well, when you look at Genesis 43, they are trying to get Jacob to send Benjamin back so they wouldn't be considered as spies. And Jacob is very reluctant because he's done lost one son, he thinks, because he's been lied to. He thinks Joseph is dead. Well, anyway, when you think about that, it is Judah that tells him that if you will send Benjamin with us, then I will put up my own sons as collateral. I'll bring him back. And the word surety is used as a guarantee in regard to Benjamin. You'll also find the parallel where it's rehearsed in Genesis 44, 30 to 34. The New American Standard Translation, and I'm not recommending that you use it as a best translation, because I'm not saying it is. What I'm saying is this is how it renders this particular word. And it translates it guarantee. A guarantee. So when you talk about Jesus being the surety of the new covenant, it is his guarantee that he will fulfill whatever he said he would fulfill if you remain faithful. And so you will also find in Hebrews 8 and verse 6, this covenant that he mentions is called a better covenant and says it is a more excellent ministry. Well, why is it a better covenant? The more excellent ministry. And then if you look, it provides better promises according to 2 Peter 1 verse 4 and Hebrews 8, 10 to 12. That's why that covenant is better. That's why it's superior. And because of the superiority of this covenant, and because that Christ is the one that initiated this covenant, sealed it with his blood, gives it his guarantee, then Christ of necessity is greater than the covenant. And if the covenant is greater than Moses, Christ is greater than Moses and his covenant superior. Another thing to consider is that the new covenant is distinct from the first. It's very distinct from the first because it makes reference in Hebrews 8, 7 to 8 that if the first covenant had been faultless. Now that's something to think about right there. Faultless. But then he goes down in verse 8 and says he found fault with them. Well, the question arises, to what does the word them refer? Is it the people? Is it the idea that the covenant was distinct in the sense that the faults of the first covenant was the faults of the people? And the reason I ask that is this. If that was the weakness of the first covenant, you've got the same weakness in the second covenant because we're faultless. So what is he referring to here? It's true that there was fault with the people, but was there any weakness with the covenant? Well, you think about it from this standpoint. As far as what it was intended to do, no. It was a perfect covenant in regard to what it was designed to do, to bring to light the knowledge of sin, to bring us to Christ. Its purpose, it was perfect. But can you tell me some ways that it was imperfect? It could not take away sin forever. What about the sacrifices it offered? Were they inferior sacrifices? So there were things that needed to be done that the old covenant could not do, because if it had been faultless, there would have been no need for the second. Had it provided everything you needed, there would be no reason to have a second covenant. And so the reason I've asked you that, and this is something that you need to study for yourself. But as I was looking at this and considering this, and of course I thought about it before as well, that when you talk about finding fault with them, you've got to ask them what? Because you can use the word them to individuals, you can use the word them to objects. You can use the word them for a number of things. And if you're talking about, well, the fault of the first covenant had to do with the people sinning, then does that mean people under the second covenant is without sin? And so it just doesn't seem to fit the context. But I'll leave it up to you to do your own research. That's things that I think that do need to be considered. I do not disagree that there was faults with the people under the first covenant. Naturally, they sinned. They had weaknesses. And at the same time, under the new covenant, we have the same thing. Because you think about Hebrews 4, verse 15, when he said, we have not an high priest, which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was tempted in all points like as we are, yet without sin. Now, you notice that phrase, cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, which is rendered weaknesses. People today have their weaknesses, their sin, the things they struggle with, just like they did under the old covenant. So that's the reason that I asked the question, is he referring to the people? And if so, in what way? Or in what way are we faultless? And if referring to sin, that it is also a problem under this covenant. And if the provisions of the law, then in what way was the old covenant not without fault? In other words, what was it under the old covenant that it could not provide that the new covenant needed to provide? And it's exactly what Eddie said a while ago, forgiveness in the absolute sense, a perfect sacrifice, a different type of blood, greater blessings than Canaan. The old law couldn't provide that. Before I go any further, do you have any comments or questions about that particular statement, Hebrews 8? Here's another thing that makes the new covenant superior, and therefore Christ superior. Under the old law, the commandment of God was written in stone. That's referred to in 2 Corinthians 3. It's also referred to right here in Hebrews, in the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 10, he makes this statement. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. I will be to them a God, and they shall be to me a people. And they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least to the greatest. And I will be merciful to their unrighteousness, and their sin and iniquity will I remember no more. And then that he saith, a new covenant, he hath made the first old, and that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. And sometimes people have confusion on what he means of it being ready to vanish away. He is referring to the destruction of the entire Jewish commonwealth, not just the law that was nailed to the cross. The Jews still had their sacrifices. They still had their records. They still had their priests. They still had the temple. They had everything. But whenever that Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed, the entire Jewish commonwealth was destroyed with it. And that's what it's referring to. Another thing to keep in mind, in this regard at least, being put in their hearts and their minds, look also at chapter 10 and about verse 16. Because here he says, this is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws in their hearts and write them in their minds, or in them their minds will I write them. So the thing interesting is this, going back to Hebrews 8, they shall not teach every man his neighbor, saying, Know the Lord. Well, now why in the world would he make that kind of a statement? Because under the law, you were born into relationship with God if you were born a Jew. You were born into the covenant. After you were born into the covenant, then you taught the children to know the Lord. And that's where the emphasis is. They speak of them when you lie down, when you sit up, when you go out of your house, and so on. You educate those children who've been born into the covenant regarding the God they are to serve. Under the new covenant, you are taught to know the Lord before you enter the covenant. It is necessary to be properly taught before you become a child of God. Under the law, you were born into it. Under the new covenant, you're born into it, but you are taught prior to being born into it. And that's what John 6:44 and 5 is all about. When he talks about no man can come to me except the Father which has sent me draw him, and I'll raise him up in the last day, for it is written in the prophets, they shall all be taught of God. Every man, therefore, that hath heard and learned of the Father cometh unto me. And so when they become children of God, and by this new covenant, then they enjoy a unique relationship with him because of their education, which resulted in their new birth, which brought about a relationship between them and God, distinct from the old covenant. The new covenant was foretold in Jeremiah 31 to 33, and you'll also find it alluded to in 2 Corinthians 3. I want us to go very briefly to 2 Corinthians 3, because I hear so much sometimes from people about how, in fact, just the other day in a study I had with a fellow, he made reference to the fact, Bill, aren't we still living by the 10 Commandments? And I went into Colossians 2:14, I went into Ephesians 3:15, went into Galatians 3, went to 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Now, I want you to pay, if you would, very close attention to the wording that Paul uses in connection with this. Now, what he says is, do we begin again to commend ourselves, or need we, as some others? Epistles of commendation to you are letters of commendation from you. You are epistles written in our hearts, known and read of all men. For as much as you are manifestly declared to be the epistles of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshly tables of the heart, he said. And such trust have we through Christ to Godward. Not that we're sufficient of ourselves to think anything as of ourselves, but our sufficiency is of God, who has also made us able ministers of the New Testament, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. The letter killeth, but the Spirit giveth life. Now, if you want to know another insufficiency of the law, right here it's stated. It cannot give you life. And then it goes down and says, but if the ministration of death, written and engraven in stones, was glorious, so that the children of Israel could not steadfastly behold the face of Moses for the glory of his countenance, which glory was to be done away. That is the Ten Commandments. So when you think about, and people try to convince you that the Ten Commandments are still binding today, they are not as the Ten Commandments. Now, 9 of the commandments are reiterated in the New Testament. That's the reason we observe them, not because they were a part of the original 10. And so if you were bound by the 10 commandments, you'd still be observing the Sabbath. Another thing to consider in regard to this is that the covenant will take the place of the old covenant. And that's exactly what Hebrews 8 verse 13 says. That which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. The word decayeth means to make worn out or declare obsolete. That's what the word decayeth means. To wax old simply means something that fails because of age. We understand that in regard to physical health. And so when you look at this idea of decayeth and waxeth old, you begin to realize that because of its age, and because of its inabilities to accomplish certain things, it is going to be rendered obsolete. And it doesn't carry the idea that it's just going to render itself obsolete. It carries the idea that it is going to be rendered obsolete. And that's exactly what occurred when Christ nailed it to the cross. Now, if you want an example of the waxing old, John 21 and verse 18, as the Lord discusses with Peter his fate when he is old. And that is going to be by crucifixion. You get the idea of what he means by waxeth old in Hebrews 8:13. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 11 and 12, when he says, if therefore perfections were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, then what further need, it says, was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek and not be called after the order of Aaron? He's talking about the priesthood. For the priesthood being changed, there is made a necessity also a change of a law. And so the bottom line of that is that this is referring again to the removal of the old covenant. Because if it's true that there had to be a change of law because there was change in priesthood, And if Christ now is our high priest, it necessitates the change of a law. And so you go from the old covenant to the new. Then another thing to consider in regard to this is that the new covenant is described as an everlasting covenant. Now, let me suggest something to you here, and you'll find this in Hebrews 3, and you probably already know this. And so I'm not telling you anything that you don't know or anything that you haven't already thought about. But the thing that I wanted us to consider is the word everlasting. Your context has to tell you how the word everlasting is used. Even the old covenant was called an everlasting covenant. But the emphasis of everlasting was that it would be everlasting. It would not cease to exist until it was brought to completion. And the same thing is true with the new covenant. Let me ask you this. What's the purpose of the new covenant? What's the purpose of it? Do what? Salvation. All right. When you get to heaven, are you still going to need it? Well, then everlasting doesn't mean eternal in the sense of without end, does it? It's referring to its intended time is expired. You're not going to need the priesthood, which deals with sin. You're not going to need a new covenant by which you're to comply. You have now in heaven received everything Christ has guaranteed you. By everlasting, it just simply means perpetual when you're referring to the covenants. So the purpose is stated in verse 21. When you look at Hebrews 13, because it says to make you perfect or complete in every good work to do his will, working in you that which is well-pleasing unto God. Well, you stop and you read verse 20 and say, now the God of peace brought again from the dead the Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, through the blood of the everlasting covenant. Why did he do that? So he can make you complete in every way and present you acceptable in the sight of God. That's what the covenant's designed to do. Another thing, when he says to make you perfect in every good work or complete, do you remember the passage that says that he's given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness? That's in the new covenant. That's 2 Peter 1, verse 3. Now let's look at another thing in regard to this covenant. I know I'm not covering it all, but I'm doing the best I know how. Another thing in regard to the superiority of the covenant is this covenant was sealed with the blood of Jesus Christ. And that's exactly what Hebrews 13 and verse 20 says. And you'll also find, we don't went over this with the previous one, the blood of the everlasting covenant. But I want you to also look, if you would, at Hebrews 9, 18 through 20. He said, whereupon neither the first tabernacle was dedicated without blood, for when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and of goats and water and scarlet wool, hyssop, and sprinkled both the book and all the people, saying, this is the blood of the testament which God hath enjoined unto you. Moreover, he sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry. Now, when you look at that, you begin to realize it required even blood under the old covenant to seal it. Well, what makes it different on the new covenant? Because that was the blood of animals. The new covenant is sealed with the blood of Christ. That's the difference. Now, the new covenant also requires the death of the testator. It's just like even today, when people make up a will, that will does not go into effect until the person that made the will is deceased. In some instances, not with the Bible covenant, but with our covenants or our wills, there may be a 6-month probation period. But the idea is that a will does not go into effect until the executor of that will is deceased. And the same thing is true with Christ. Christ's covenant could not come into effect until his death. His death not only provided a means of our salvation and giving us a new life or a new family and all of those things, it also was a means of providing for us a better covenant to live under. And so when you look, for example, in Hebrews 9:16 and 17, he says, "For where a testament is, there must, not can be, must be, the death of the testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead. Otherwise, it is of no strength at all while the testator liveth." So the only way that the new covenant could come into being is if Jesus had died, and that he did. And so if Christ had not died, and you think about it from this perspective, when they were walking by and they said, "If he be Christ, let him come down from the cross," they had no earthly idea what they were advocating. If he had not come down from the cross, there'd be no forgiveness. If he had come down from the cross, there'd be no new life. If he had come down from the cross, there'd have been no hope, not even for those under the first covenant. If he had come down from the cross, there would have been no new covenant, and there would have been no church. When you look, for example, the last thing I want us to look at is the new covenant had a better mediator. In Hebrews 9 and verse 15, "For this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament." The word mediator means a reconciler, a go-between. And the thing that's important about this is if Jesus had not died, we would have no avenue of reconciliation with God. That's not in a permanent sense. Jesus was the bridge that bridged the gap that existed between us and God because of our own sin. You can read that in Isaiah 59, 1 and 2. And so he is the means by which that he arbitrates between us and God. And you can get in 1 Timothy 2:5, one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. Same thing, Hebrews 8:6 and 12:24. So mediation indicates an offender. It indicates an offended. The offender is us. The offended is God. And Christ is the avenue of bridging the distance that has been generated between us and God. So when you think about this new covenant is the avenue that Christ uses. And somebody said, "Well, what in the world do you mean?" Christ died to bridge the gap, but there had to be information provided on our part in order for us to understand what we have to do in order for Christ to bridge that gap. And so that's what the new covenant is all about. And so if you look on the very back of your sheets, you will find that there is a contrast between the old and the new covenant. And I wish we had time to go over it, but we don't.